Greetings, beloved family, and best wishes for Emancipation for 2020 to all of the management and the staff, and by extension also the clients and customers of WASA, the Water and Sewage Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. It is an honor for me once again, this time for Emancipation 2020, to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you for Emancipation 2020 under the theme 1970, remembering, reconnecting, and recommitting, which is such a powerful theme, especially since this year, 2020, we mark the 50th anniversary celebration of the 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad. So we want to remember it, but we also in this day and time want to reconnect ourselves to that tremendous experience for this nation and by extension the wider Caribbean. But we also want to recommit ourselves to the aims, goals, and objectives, the vision, the mission, and the principles under which the 1970 Black Power Revolution was founded. So, in first remembering 1970, let's look at the build-up to that great event that took place in Trinidad and Tobago. And in order to really understand 1970, we have to understand the 1960s. Because that was a moment of self-discovery for Trinidad and Tobago and the West Indies in general, because it was just before the 1960s began. In 1958, we established the Federation of the West Indies. And then we became independent in 1962, and there were specific expectations that the general population of this country had. Bear in mind, going back just a little bit further to around 1925, where partial adult suffrage was introduced, where for the first time, members of the general public were allowed to vote. And then in the 1930s, through the mid-period, there was a series of labor uprisings and rebellions throughout all of the major Caribbean cities, in Kingston, Jamaica, in Bridgetown, Barbados, in Kingstown, St. Vincent, in Castries, St. Lucia, in St. Kitts, Basseterre, and in St. John's, Antigua, as well as Georgetown, Guyana, and Fyzabad in Trinidad. There were these uprisings based on the sensitivity that in the mid-1930s, we were 100 years up from emancipation, but it was still as if we were living as modern-day slaves 100 years later, when we should have been totally liberated. But we were not. So there was this domino effect of rebellions and uprisings and revolutions and insurrections all across the Caribbean in reaction and response to that consciousness of being freed 100 years later, but not the kind of freedom that we expected. And many of these uprisings in the mid-1930s were based on the trade union movement and labor rights and the seeking for a higher standard of living and quality of life for the average worker. So after there was this series of uprisings and rebellions all across the Caribbean region, and on June the 19th, 1937, Uriah Buzz Butler became a key figure after the event at the Charlie King Junction in Fyzabad, where, of course, Charlie King, a policeman who was set on fire and killed, and they were looking for Butler. A number of calypsos have really immortalized that story and archived it in our history, which is where a lot of our general information on our history is stored, in the calypso music of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But coming out of the 1930s, the British, the colonial authorities, decided to have a commission of inquiry to try to figure out how they can stop all of these rebellions all across the Caribbean. And this commission of inquiry, which was entitled the Moyne Commission, concluded, among other factors, that if we allow the general public to vote in the general elections without the kind of restrictions that there were prior for partial adult suffrage in 1925, then when they have problems with the state, and when they experience and oppressive nature from the colonial authorities, if we let them vote and let them occupy the seats of political power, then when they have issues with the state, they will take it out on each other instead of taking out all of that frustration and grief and anxiety and stress on us, so said the colonial whites. So in 1946, they did pass full adult suffrage, and now everyone was allowed to vote, and the whites, who were once the dominant key frontline political figures, have now decided to take a back seat, going behind the scenes, and they would have the blacks go up front, and they would now give their funding and financing for the campaigns so that they could secure their economic interests. This expectation that we had from the politics is reflected in the voting patterns. Because in 1950, for the election there, the voter turnout was 70%. For the next election in 1956, the voter turnout was 80%. And then the year just before we became independent, in 1961, the voter turnout in Trinidad and Tobago was actually 88.1%. 88%, that's almost everyone. That is massive. But you see, the thing is that when we voted 1 year before independence, we thought to ourselves, but maybe this is going to be the solution to all of our problems. Maybe we will enter into a new kind of liberation where we will control the commanding heights of the economy and rule over the means and forces of production. Maybe we will be totally and completely liberated out of poverty. But after that 88.1% turnout in the election of 1961, there has never, ever been an election in Trinidad and Tobago that had a voter turnout of more than 69.9%. So it says a lot about the expectations that the general public had. So coming into independence in 1962, slowly but surely we began to see a dissatisfaction brewing with the trade union movement, with strikes, industrial action, with organizations coming together and appealing for a better life. We would have thought that independence would have done this, but apparently it did not. So when 1970 came, it was, as some of the historians say, a watershed moment, where now the voice was being heard, because 8 years after the Union Jack was lowered and the red, white, and black national flag of Trinidad and Tobago was raised, and that we were given our national anthem that said, "Here every creed and race finds an equal place," and we were given our national watchwords of discipline, production, and tolerance, and we were given a national pledge where we solemnly declared to dedicate our lives to the service of our God and our country. And we were given a coat of arms that said, "Together we aspire and together we achieve," as a motto. All of that was beautiful as literature, as language, as slogans, as sayings, and as symbols. But the real economic control was in the hands of those who were the descendants of the slave masters and the slave owners. So here comes 1970. And the spirit of revolution enters into the hearts and the minds of the people. We would have heard on many occasions about all of those factors that would have led up to what happened, and where great leaders would have emerged. McCandle Dagger, formerly known as Geddes Granger, Kafra Cambon, formerly known as Dave Dowrow, and Brother Clive Nunez, and some of the other leaders at the time who were organizing, motivating, inspiring young people in particular to get involved, to become conscious, to read, to get knowledgeable, to be sensitive to the kind of social change that was required in our country. And that new wave of consciousness was accompanied by a fear and paranoia on the part of the state. And meanwhile, the United States of America was looking at this new consciousness that was a wave across the whole region. Now, this 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago was a powerful event that influenced so many others around the world, but we were also influenced by some great thinkers and philosophers, such as our own Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael. Right now, I am in the Kwame Ture Education Center, which was built by the Black Agenda Project organization that was founded by members of the Nation of Islam under the leadership of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. We acquired 3/4 of an acre of land, and we constructed with our own hands a 6,000 square foot building. And in that building, we offer a range of free services to our people. Free lessons, classes, we have workshops and seminars. We've even had weddings and funerals and birthrights. Right in here, Black history, lectures on a weekly basis, study groups, martial arts training, sisters classes, brothers classes. A fully functional and operational institution that was really established by an idea by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, where he said we must unite and pool our resources, and that the black man must do for self or suffer the consequences. He taught us to open skills banks and think tanks. And of course, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was also the teacher of Malcolm X, who said that if you don't stand up for something, you will fall for anything, and that we must achieve and accomplish our goals by any means necessary. But even onto the consciousness of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam, and his students, such as Malcolm X, Minister Louis Farrakhan, who was my teacher, and even the great Muhammad Ali. You also had the influence of minds such as Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Messiah Garvey said, Africa for the Africans at home and abroad, suggesting that we must reconnect ourselves with our entire global family. And then Marcus Garvey said, a people without a knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. You're disconnected. But then we also say a people who do not properly study their history run the risk of having that history rewritten for them by someone else in the best interest of those others, rather than in the best interest of ourselves. So we have this background of knowledge. And based on the Black Power philosophy of Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, born right here in Porto, Spain, we were able to influence a consciousness in the minds of our people to create this institution, the Kwame Ture Education Center. But the great Kwame Ture was banned from entering Trinidad around the time of the 1970 Black Power Revolution, in spite of the fact that he was born in Trinidad. Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael, became the head of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, who in 1963 led the March on Washington on August the 28th, another powerful moment in Black history that would have been part of the build-up to 1970 in Trinidad and really all over the world. And it was really in the last days of Dr. Martin Luther King when he began to share a new consciousness. Because in spite of the fact that he tried to integrate with his enemies and persistently and consistently forgive them for their brutality against him, in his last days, Dr. Martin Luther King said, in quoting Hugo Victor, Dr. King said, if there is darkness, sin will be committed. But the real guilty one is not so much he who commits the sin as it is him who created the darkness. And then he said, white America has created the darkness that black people are committing their sins in. That we, according to Dr. Martin Luther King, were not the architects of the crimes that we were languishing in the jails for, but we were victims of a system that we had absolutely no hand whatsoever in the establishment of. So Dr. Martin Luther King in his last days called for boycotts of businesses where the money is not redirected into development of the community in one way or another. And speaking of boycotts, now let me put a bookmark by 1970 just for a short moment, and let's come back up 50 years later to 2020. Because we have a global event that took place that was sparked off on May 20th, 2020, where a black man by the name of George Floyd was killed by a white police officer who kneeled down on his neck and for over 8 minutes, without mercy, without a sense of humanity, took the life of this black man, which was symbolic of the lives of so many others. Remember, since going back to February 26, 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was killed by Mark Zimmerman, who thought that Trayvon Martin had a weapon on him, but it was just a pack of Skittles. Jordan Davis, 17 years old, was killed by a white man, Michael Dunn, because Jordan Davis was playing his music too loud in his car. You had Walter Scott, who was shot while running away from a white police officer. You had 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. Again, someone made a phone call, said he had a weapon. White police pull up, execute him immediately. You had Freddie Gray, who was put in the back of a police van and driven all across the state to injure him. He ended up dead. Michael Brown, who said, "My hands are up, don't shoot," in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And I was blessed to meet the father of Michael Brown. And so many of these stories, so many of these cases, but it was really Eric Garner, who was choked to death in Staten Island, New York, who also said, "I cannot breathe." But little did we know, even with a few months before, when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, just a few weeks literally before George Floyd, just like our beloved brother, Botham Jean, whose family is from St. Lucia, who was the victim of a murder by a white police officer who broke into his apartment, said that she thought she was in her apartment, saw him, became afraid, and executed him. And you know what's so strange about that particular episode? When she was in court and crying and saying she didn't know and she didn't mean it and it was an accident, the black people, including the family members, gravitated in sympathy around her. They hugged her. One of them was even combing her hair. But, okay, understood as an isolated case, but when you put that in the context of the genocide that has been consistently committed against African people for a 400-year span, is it that all of that is to be overlooked? And of course, right now, politically, we're in the so-called silly season. And when you listen, you see so many moments of insensitivity towards our cause, towards our struggle, towards our history and heritage and legacy as African people. So one political leader says that the COVID-19 restrictions or being denied access back into our country is compared in one way to slavery and indentureship. First of all, indentureship cannot even be compared to slavery. And the closest thing that could be compared to slavery was the Jewish Holocaust, and not even that comes close to slavery. The African Holocaust or enslavement was the worst of its kind for four main reasons. One, the number of lives lost. And we could compare it to the second worst, the Jewish Holocaust. Over 100 million African people murdered or displaced through genocide, through the Middle Passage and on the plantations over that 400-year span. The Jewish Holocaust saw the taking of the lives of only 6 million people in comparison to over 100,000. Secondly, the duration of time. As we said, over 300 years of genocide against African people during enslavement starting in 1555. The Jewish Holocaust lasted from 1939 to 1945, barely 6 years. 3, the intergenerational as well as the intragenerational effect that slavery had on the African family in particular. Because the black man was used as a stud horse to breed stronger slaves, the black woman was repeatedly raped by the slave master, and we were denied the right to be a family. And they would use us to breed and reproduce human beings that were being used for economic purposes to amass wealth for the Europeans. None of that happened in indentureship, more or less during COVID-19. And then fourth, you have the psychological damage that was done against African people who have been injected with a very peculiar type of self-hatred and self-loathing. Hence, when you look in our communities, you're seeing a black-on-black murder rate that is astronomical, as if we're fighting a war overseas. Now, all of those factors. But while one politician makes such a cold, insensitive statement regarding slavery, another politician a couple years back, in defending the so-called 1%, referred to the Jewish Holocaust as man's greatest inhumanity to man, when not even that compares or comes close to African enslavement. But we cannot afford to only become black conscious when it comes to politics. We cannot afford to only lift our voices in condemnation of ignorant, insensitive, and racist statements and remarks that are uttered only when it means scoring points within a political rivalry. We have to be black conscious all the time, especially not just at emancipation. So let's go back to 1970, because for 55 days, from February 26th to April 21st, 1970, there was uprising in the street. Then Dr. Eric Williams called a state of emergency. On April the 6th, 1970, there was the funeral of Basil Davis that attracted close to 30,000 people. Martyred as a sample and example of the police brutality that was representative of the colonial white interests against us. There were the marches. There was the unity, temporarily at least, between Africans and Indians. It was a brother by the name of Errol Balfour Flynn who did that banner, Africans and Indians Unite, which became, for many media houses, the key symbol of the 1970 Black Power Revolution. But at the end of the day, it was about the masses on the street. And really, when you look at the Caribbean during that period, it was a time of consciousness. You had Prime Minister Errol Barrow in Barbados. You had Michael Manley in Jamaica. And you had Forbes Burnham in Guyana, all of whom have been demonized by their political opponents. But again, I say put the politics aside and let's look at the bigger picture. You had the establishment of CARICOM on July 4th, 1973, and the consolidation of powerful black nations. Again, coming up with the consciousness of 1970, where we were reading. Young people were getting knowledge, absorbing information, seeing learning now as something productive and progressive. The sharing of information in groups and study circles, young men being inspired by great world icons such as Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And you had our great brother, the leader of another magnificent movement in Africa, Sekou Touré, whom Kwame Touré took the surname of and the first name of Kwame Nkrumah. and formed the name Kwame Ture of the first two leaders of the first two independent African nations in the New World. So 1970 saw great results as well, because for the first time you saw dark-skinned people working in banks and the banking sector, but apart from the visibility, there was also a new reawakening of African people. And we now, with literature such as Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, and Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's Message to the Black Man, and also the autobiography of Malcolm X. Learning was now in vogue, it was now in style. So that's the remembering and the reconnecting, but now we have to recommit. Are we going to temporarily wear African clothes and then move on to abandoning and aborting and rejecting and neglecting African consciousness for 11 or 12 more months until next year emancipation season? Are we going to say, I'm going to support black business only when someone makes a racist, offensive statement against us, and only when we feel hurt, we say, well, it's time now for me to support African-owned businesses? Why is that the emergency valve reaction instead of the default setting? What is stopping our unity? Why can't we pool our resources and end that crabs in a barrel syndrome and mentality? Regardless of social class, regardless of religion, regardless of area of residence, we have to start thinking about passing on a baton to the next generation, particularly as it pertains to agriculture. Because if 1,000 poor people grow $1,000 worth of food in 1 year, that is $1 million in food security injected into that community, which translates into $1 million less in robberies and petty street crimes. Now we have a greater secured future for the next generation, something for them to stand on. And by passing on the culture of agriculture, we now are giving them something that they could pass on to the generation following them. And so thinking about the future must involve establishing some kind of programs or supporting programs like the one at the Kwame Ture Education Center for young children, where we give free lessons to the CSEC or CXC students. So as I conclude, remember to keep inspiring the youth. That's the future. That's the recommitment, or the commitment for the first time. Remember, pass on to our youth the knowledge of Africa. Remember to pass on to our youth the knowledge of them being the mothers and fathers of civilization. That the first libraries, schools, colleges, universities, and learning centers were all in Africa. The first towns, villages, cities, and civilizations were all in Africa. And in traditional Africa, we did not have old age homes because we were not abandoning our elderly. We did not have prisons because we were not breaking the law. We did not have orphanages because we were not abandoning our children. And we did not have drug rehabilitation centers and halfway houses because there was no illegal narcotics trade. Remember to pass on to our children the knowledge of the greatness of themselves and the potential that they possess. Let them know that it was a black man named Louis Latham who invented the light bulb. It was a black man named Granville T. Woods who drew the design for the telephone. It was a black man named Garrett Morgan who invented the traffic light and the gas mask. It was a black man named Jay Stannard who invented the refrigerator. It was a black man named J.A. Burr who invented the lawnmower. A black man named A. Miles who invented the elevator. A black man named George Washington Carver invented over 300 synthetic products from pecan, peanut, and sweet potato. It was black people who gave science, mathematics, art, philosophy, and music to all of humanity. But from 640 to 322 BC, there was an exodus of European students into Africa to rape and plunder our resources and also our libraries, our information centers, the writings on the wall and the pyramids, the Metuneta. But it's all in us. And if it was in us back then, it can come back out of us now once again. So I greet you with best wishes for for Emamcipation 2020, again, remembering 1970, not just as history, but as contemporary sociology, passing on something for the future out of what we would have learned from the lessons of 1970. And to all the management and staff of WASA, Water and Sewage Authority, I once again greet you for Emamcipation 2020. I'd like to thank you for the honor and the privilege to have the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And I pray that something that I said would be inspiring to you in one way or another. Best wishes.